Welcome back. We continue our infrastructure focus. Growing calls for government to ramp up its plans to deal with the country's poor road infrastructure. The bad state of our roads is making it difficult to transport goods and services. Not only does this have a negative impact on the economy, but socially and also in the healthcare system, particularly in underdeveloped communities far from hospitals. Meanwhile, experts believe it's only through private investment that infrastructure targets can be achieved. To discuss this further, we're joined now by Francois Strydom, CEO of Senwes. We also have with us Theo Boshoff. He's the CEO of Agbiz. Gentlemen, thank you so much to both of you for taking part in this discussion this evening. Francois, I want to start off with you, if I may. You only have to plan a trip to go and see a farm somewhere in the Free State or the Northwest, and one of the first logistical issues that the farmer will broach with you is which roads to take and which are not safe to travel on. Can you tell us which are some of the worst affected areas or provinces?
Well, there's almost no exception, only the problem with farming in South Africa, one of the problems is the fact that we import most of our imports, our production inputs. And then, of course, once we have produced, we have to then get it to market. The rail infrastructure is almost non-existent. Therefore, you have to bring it in by road. And that problem now exacerbated by the extra heavy load it has to take. So the shortest route these days are not functional normally. You have to work out plans to get your product in and to get your product to market. So I think the Free State, the Northwest, Eastern Cape, those are some of the most affected areas. But I think if you speak to farmers across South Africa, they would say that it's almost the same anywhere.
Theo, if I can come to you and talk a little bit on the impact. So farmers are spending more on vehicle maintenance, on replacing tyres, even on repairing roads themselves. That's the role of local government. But why is it not happening?
Thank you, Annie. You're 100% right. And I think it's an important point to mention. I mean, you did include in your introduction to state that, there are underdeveloped areas of South Africa where potentially roads and rail infrastructure has never been built and requires investment. I certainly agree with that. But I think an important aspect is that many of the areas that Francois also mentions, there is budgeted amounts coming from the equitable share from National Treasury. There's obviously local businesses also paying municipal property rates, which is supposed to go to maintaining the infrastructure. So the challenge really isn't one of a lack of funds necessarily. It's a management issue, that the funds are not necessarily adequately spent on, either not effectively spent or not fully spent, as can be seen by many of the Auditor General reports on some of the errant municipalities around the country. And it's a really important matter, not just for farmers, but for agribusinesses as well, to maintain competitiveness. If you do look internationally, transport costs and logistics do comprise a large percentage of the cost of food. And of course, when you're exporting or importing, the competitiveness to be able to compete on prices is a very important element of being able to have a sustainable business. In other countries, maybe some of the production areas might be situated closer to a port for export. Other countries have got navigable rivers and functioning rail infrastructure. We don't necessarily have that. We do rely quite heavily on a road infrastructure, and the distances between the ports as well as the hinterland where most of the production takes place is quite vast. So it's important to maintain our competitiveness, to actually invest in this and to make sure their spending takes place. So it is really money well spent, I think, to improve the competitiveness of the agricultural sector. The money is there. It simply needs to be utilized effectively and fully.
I want to talk about the value chain in a moment, but Francois, something that is quite heartening to see is that farmers, they get up and they do things for themselves alongside agribusinesses, banks, private companies. How does it work when these farmers just get involved, muck in, and they fix the roads themselves?
Of course, our local agribusinesses only is deployed in the rural area. And the relationship between them and their clients, the farmers, are a very tight and a long-standing relationship, and communities in the rural areas has long since, been able to help each other. So there's different models. In the case of Senwes, we bought 2 graders, and our farmers, when we're in a specific area, we contact them and they will provide diesel and security, while we give the capex and the OPEX. In many cases, we provide it with a driver. But there's many ways, and in other areas, some of the other agribusinesses has a different model. The fact is that we've taken over that role, as we've done with security, as we're busy with water. It is unfortunately a defensive mechanism that we use. In other words, capital that should be spent productively on growing the industry is now spent defensively, and of course energy these days are the big issue. So a large part of the spend of the farmer and the agribusinesses and further on in the value chain has to go to these essential services. I just wanted to add, while it is not, as Theo said, a question of the funds not being available and not being spent, I think the elephant in the room is criminality, is ineptness. The fact that government has just, for all intents and purposes, has just fallen apart at national, provincial, and local level, and that is really the elephant in the room. Absolute lack of leadership and a will to help South Africans.
So, and that corruption and malfeasance, while some farmers have the capability to address it and to defensively spend on putting the infrastructure there that they need, there are many small-scale farmers who simply do not have that capacity. Theo, talk to us about the impact on their ability to produce and to farm sustainably when the infrastructure that they need just as much as the commercial farmers do simply isn't there for them either.
Yes, thanks, Sonia. Absolutely. I mean, it does affect all producers and all agribusinesses. I think, as Francois mentioned, there's really very few exceptions in the country. But if you do look at where small-scale farmers are concentrated, there are some rural areas in the Northwest Province and in the Eastern Cape, for instance, where the roads really are in shocking condition. And depending on the commodity, agriculture is a perishable product, so number one is time sensitive, and it's also very quality sensitive. So aside from being able to access it, the state in which the degradation that can take place in the quality of the product once it reaches market does have a huge impact. And for small-scale farmers and some of the smaller, more rural-based agribusinesses as well, this will have a huge implication. It almost becomes a debt trap of sort. If you need to travel further to access the market, which is usually the case for small-scale farmers, especially in the communal areas of South Africa, to access our commercial markets or even export opportunities, they do need to travel further than some of the other industries. Then certainly that pressure to maintain the quality, and again, in agriculture, the access to market is very much dependent on the quality that you can deliver to market and the time which you can deliver to market. It has a huge impact.
I want to talk a little bit about the agricultural and agro-processing master plan. It's been called a roadmap for the agricultural sector, but it's quite ironic in the sense that roads are one of the very big challenges facing agriculture. Theo, does that AMP address road infrastructure, rail infrastructure, and plans to try and beef those up and put them in place where they have not been in place?
So AMP, whilst I agree it's a good roadmap, pun intended, but there are certain elements, of course, this was negotiated between the industry and primarily the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. So some of these elements, whilst it was noted, optimal efficiency of the port, rejuvenating some of the rail linkages which could be viable, and of course the road infrastructure which we're discussing today. These are vital elements that were mentioned in the AMP. As far as firm concrete plans to turn this around, I think that perhaps falls a little bit outside the AMP simply because it falls in the ambient of other government departments. There are, I believe, some quick wins that one can achieve. If you look specifically at our roads, the national roads and certain provincial roads that are administered by SANRAL, for instance, they tend to be better maintained. The expenditure on maintenance is a little bit more efficient. They have indicated that in parallel processes, perhaps at the AMP, that they do have the appetite and the capacity to take on the maintenance for additional roads, especially provincial roads connecting some of the rural towns. But what is required is provincial sign-off for those roads and the responsibility to be transferred. So this is really sort of a red tape requirement that can quite easy, which is one feasibly would think is a quick win or easy way in which simply transferring some of the responsibility can kickstart something which can have a meaningful difference. So there's a number of these elements. Also, alternative to road in certain areas, especially for long haul and some of the less perishable products, would of course be rail between the coastal areas and the inland areas. That's another thing which the AMP does mention. But the AMP is a plan, and the plan is not self-executing. So what you do need is commitment from all the stakeholders, all the government departments. So that includes, of course, national as well as provincial departments of roads and the state-owned entities which administer some of the roads and the rail and port infrastructure to actually buy into the plan and to work cooperatively to implement it. So whilst the plan does certainly include these elements, as I mentioned, it's not self-executing. So we need the political will, I think, as Francois has mentioned, that to actually get this going and to implement this.
Francois, so I mentioned earlier that the value chain is affected throughout. So it's not just producers who are severely impacted by decaying road infrastructure. It's also agro-processors, it's the logistical sector, it's retailers, it's informal markets. There's a massive trickle-down effect. Theo was just saying we need the political will to fix the impact on all of those elements of the value chain. Two-part question. Do you think we are close to getting buy-in from government? Because the agricultural sector seems to be one of the sectors where there really are earnest conversations taking place, and there seems to be, a good level of trust on policy level from the department and the key role players. So that's the first part. Do you think we're close to getting that buy-in? And overall, what are your big fears for agriculture if this specific element, infrastructure, is not addressed?
Well, yeah, so unfortunately the question is, or the answer is no. We haven't seen any feasible proof of government coming to the party, and the problem is that agriculture and the department cannot function in isolation. They're interdependent on all the other government spheres. So that is the first issue. The second issue is, and it's not a doomsday issue, it's reality. If any basic production system, food production system, isn't functioning, three things happen. The first is price goes up. The second thing is availability goes down. And the third thing is safety, food safety is, it goes out of the window. So those are at the basis of any society. And you can only look to the north of us. We have very, very feasible examples where that has been the case, and those economies has been decimated. So this is reality. This is where we are. And it seems that government is bound on philosophy and all kinds of tricks and trades. This has to be, unfortunately, has to be sorted out on political level. We need to get a new government in place with a will to serve.
Theo, so we keep talking about economic growth. Our country will only become more stable. We'll improve socioeconomic issues if we manage to grow the economy. Over the past 3 years, we've had really fortunate weather that has helped farmers into a good position to be able to grow their operations in terms of good, solid harvests in some commodities. But unfortunately, all the value chains are interdependent, and it's a bit of a catch-22. So the more freight we put on our roads, the more weight we put on our roads, and the further the decay progresses unless we really maintain them. So do you think road infrastructure specifically has hamstrung growth in the agricultural sector to such a degree that it is marked, that it is noticeable?
Thanks, Anya. I think in terms of the cost pressures, perhaps yes. I think Francois mentioned in detail the work that farmers associations and agribusinesses are doing. So the money that's being spent that could have been reinvested in growing the economy and creating more jobs are going to maintaining the road infrastructure. But I would almost say the opposite in terms of road infrastructure, at the very least, has, in spite of the challenges, the agricultural value chain.
Unfortunately, we seem to have lost Theo there. Very important discussion. We've been continuing this discussion for a couple of weeks now. We've looked at our road and our rail infrastructure. We've looked at hospital infrastructure. It is a critical issue, and it seems that from all sectors they're saying we absolutely need government buy-in. Francois, I believe you are still with us.
I am.
If you can give us a short closing, I know you've said that we need government buy-in. Unfortunately, many people in the agriculture sector just seem a little bit despondent that that's going to happen shortly. We know we have elections next year. Is there any way that between the private sector and the agricultural sector, agricultural organizations, producers themselves, we can manage to make a plan and get things going in the meantime?
I think if we do it ourselves, only that's been happening. We've been seeing what happens in the energy sector as Eskom, fails us. The investment from private sector is just taking over hand over hand. When the load gets too heavy, that is, of course, all of our questions. The amount of time that government spends on, all the unnecessary stuff that they're busy with. Unfortunately, that just piles onto private equity or private initiative and businesses' shoulders. But again, South Africans are hopeful, and they reimagine things, and there's always hope. So as many times before, I think there is always the possibility that private sector would pull this one through as well.
Resilient, resourceful and hopeful. Thank you so much to both of you for your inputs. Francois Strydom, CEO of Senwes, and Theo Boshoff, who we lost a little bit earlier. He's the CEO of Agbiz.